full of love and light in these really perilous times. Today, we're going to talk about how Europeans became white, the making of whiteness in America. All right. I want to transition into my whites American, European American series. And I will be going across different racial groups. My wife, she's from China, so she's going to help me when I get into the Chinese American series. And just some of the history. I think it's important for all of us to kind of understand the foundations and the platforms that us today function from, the sacrifices that our ancestors have made, all right, for us to be able to live this life of luxury in the USA. And also, I think it's important for my people, African Americans, which are, there are some really great scholars and well far above, my level, that are very aware of the different histories and backgrounds of different cultural groups, but a lot for the younger people, right, who may not be awake in history class and who may not be cognizant of, some of the barriers and challenges that other communities face. I think it's important that we all kind of have an idea of where, we're coming from. So I want to start a European White American series, exploring white culture, European culture, from German, French, Irish, Jewish, Italian, right? Different backgrounds and how they became white, right? When this invention of whiteness began. Okay, it's really important to know. And it says here, when we talk about race today, the word white is often treated as if it has always existed. But the reality is that the term white people is a relatively recent invention in human history. Early European societies did not primarily identify themselves as white. They thought of themselves as English, Irish, German, Spanish, or from whatever region they belonged. So this is important to know. A lot of Europeans, German, Irish, all right, Spanish, Italian, white wasn't a concept that was used to identify themselves, right? Prior to a lot of, hey, what's up, AAA Cleaning? How you doing? God bless you. Thank you for joining. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you aren't already. Just kind of going through a history series of the different racial groups. So white wasn't really a concept that was used to define white people, all right? Prior to coming to colonial America, right? It was based off of sort of like what region of the world you're from. And I believe to this day, a lot of white people are not really looking at themselves as white, right? We got to be careful with this all or nothing thinking, right? There's a lot of people are individuals, right? Some people look at themselves like, hey, man, I'm German. Hey, I'm French. Hey, I'm Irish, right? And you got some people who are like, hey, I'm white, all right? But it's not all people, right? Necessarily. So you got to think, if I'm European and I'm living in a country of other people who look just like me, does it really matter if I call myself white? Because everybody looks like white, but it really mattered what region you were from, because each region had their own different cultural values, right? The values of the English were different than the values of the Irish, which was different from the values of the German or the French, right? Or the Spanish. So, hey, AAA Cleaning, thank you so much for joining. So it's Europeans, Germans, French, Spanish, Jewish. It wasn't about white, right? It was about, hey, which region are you from? And I do believe that, Europeans to this day, not all, but some still believe this, right? Some people get offended when you're like, hey, white, you're white, man, you're white, man. They're like, motherfucker, I'm Irish. I mean, I'm French, I'm German, So I think even as Black people, we have to be real aware, right? And educated, right? To kind of understand that not all people who happen to be fair skinned or light skinned identify as white, right? So it says the label white only became politically important in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in colonial America, right? So it was it was a way of creating a single identity that united people from different European nations, all right? against Africans, Native Americans, and others. So not all Europeans were against the African, right? You had a lot of Europeans, Germans, French who were like, "Hey, I'm not buying this shit," right? I can't give you their names, but I believe that, right? Because it wasn't all black people who aligned against white people, right? So we have to be fair across the board, all right? But there were a group, of different Europeans, Germans, French, Jewish, Spanish, who had their agendas, right? It wasn't all people, but it was a specific group, right? Who said, we got to stand out from these Native Americans and from these Africans, right? We got to have our own, sort of identity going on. So really, white didn't really come into play until certain sects of the European community felt it necessary to sort of separate themselves from other minority or groups who weren't European. Okay, so before this shift, Irish peasants, Italian laborers, and Eastern Europeans were not fully considered white in many places. The invention of whiteness was about power, property, and control, not simply skin color. All right. To understand how white emerged, we must go back to Europe, where starvation, plagues, and wars devastated populations for centuries. So a lot of the European sort of history, they were suffering, going back to early, Europe prior to colonialism, there were a lot of plagues, there were a lot of starvation, people were kind of fighting and killing each other over property. They were really going through some really significant, harsh times, all right? So to understand how white emerged, we must go back to Europe, where starvation, plagues, and wars devastated populations for centuries. All right, from the 14th century, Black Death that wiped out nearly a third of Europe, to famines in Ireland during the 19th century. European survival was marked by scarcity and suffering. All right, so what Europeans had their fair share of pain, right? They had their fair share of pain and plagues, and trauma, right, prior to coming to colonial America. Okay, so it wasn't like a lot of them were living lives of luxury and they had everything, that you can dream of and you can imagine. A lot of them were suffering, all right, prior to coming to the Americas. All right, so it's very important to kind of be aware of the reality that suffering is global, right? It's not just something that's just attached to the black community, the black identity. Many different cultures, many different ethnicities had suffering, right? So it says sugar plantation, slavery, and colonial expansion became lifelines to wealth after these catastrophes. European peasants often lived in brutal conditions, which made the promises of the new world, right, land, resources, and new beginnings so appealing. So you got to think, if I'm coming from poverty already, I'm starving, right? People who look like me is, they're a threat, right? They're coming from my land. We're fighting over, anything we can get. There's a lot of disease. There's a lot of illness going on, right? The idea of having a new beginning, right? To be able to go somewhere to get out of this suffering, right, was very, very appealing, all right, to the Europeans, okay? They're like, man, this is a way out. This is a way to get out of this really harsh condition, that we're in. But it says, but to build those new societies, colonial leaders needed hierarchy. The idea of whiteness became a tool to separate poor Europeans from enslaved Africans and indigenous people, keeping them loyal to the colonial elites. All right. This framing shaped how power and race was defined in America. You had a lot of Europeans who were indentured servants prior to coming here. And even the, colonists, when they came here and started to build up America early on in history, they were even looked down upon, to a lot of the Europeans. They're like, these damn Americans, they're crazy. They don't know what the hell they're doing, So there was a lot of even division among, early European history between, a lot of the colonists and the people who were really building up this new world in Britain, right? And Europe. They're like, you guys are like the bastard kids, right? So it wasn't just, it didn't start off as just this united front, all right? So it says the history of white is not just about dominance, it is about transformation. Groups like the Irish, once considered outsiders, were gradually absorbed into the category of white in America. This gave them the privilege over African Americans, but often came at the cost of solidarity. Similarly, German, Italian, and Eastern European immigrants fought to be included, right, in this identity. So I would believe they're probably looking at this like, man, look, we're just trying to eat. you know, if we don't get a part of this thing, we're going to suffer. We're going to die of starvation. I got family, I got kids, right? So now, this isn't me saying I agree with the atrocities that were done to the Native Indians and to the Africans, and based off of some of the causes that were going on in the European community. But it's just we have to think, right? We have to use critical thinking. All right, if you're coming from starvation, if you're coming from poverty, you're basically outnumbered, right? As a European, you don't really have a whole lot of, you know, leverage, right? You're already poor. You already got the plague. You already got all these different diseases that are going around. You're desperate, right? In that moment, whatever I got to do to get out of this condition, right? So it says this gave them privileges over African Americans, but often came at the cost of solidarity. Similarly, German, Italian, and Eastern European immigrants fought to be included in this identity, all right? Sometimes by distancing themselves from Black communities, all right? At the same time, there were white allies, okay, who resisted racial injustice and even gave their lives for equality, from abolitionists in the 1800s to freedom fighters in the civil rights era. The complexity of white identity includes those who worked for justice, not just oppression. There were Europeans who were fighting and were giving their lives for African American people, all right? Not everybody was on code with what the fuck was going on, all right? They're just like, hey, what you guys are doing ain't right, you know? And imagine how complex of a battle that was for them, right? So now they're going against their own. So now you're gonna get ostracized. All right. Oh, okay, you with these niggas. All right, you go figure out your own place to eat, right? You go figure out, you go figure out this shit on your own. And then they go out and go figure it on their own. But then they might have African Americans that are against them, but then they're trying to fight for them. They're like, well, shit, man, I'm on your side. I done gave up all this privilege. Black people like, well, shit, you're white. So even Europeans who were allies were in a tight spot because it's like you're giving up your privilege, you're giving up some of these different luxuries to be an ally, but then you still have African Americans and Black people who are looking at you like the enemy, right? So you're still kind of tucked between the two, all right? Just something to think about. So again, it says at the same time there were white allies, okay, who resisted racial injustice and even gave their lives for equality, from abolitionists in the 1800s to freedom fighters in the civil rights era. This complexity of white identity includes those who worked for justice, not just oppression. Okay. These tensions show why whiteness must be studied historically, not assumed as timeless. All right. Today, understanding the origins of the term white matters because it reveals how America was built. The foundational history of the United States cannot be told without understanding, right? European famine, disease, colonial conquest, and the invention of racial categories. America's structures of privilege and inequality are rooted in decisions made hundreds of years ago, often to benefit elites, okay, at the expense of both poor Europeans and enslaved Africans. Learning about how the Irish, Spanish, Germans, and others became white sheds light on how national identity and power were constructed. It also shows the global relationships between nations and cultures that shape the modern world. Okay, when we understand this, we can see deeply history shapes today's conversations about race and belonging, and it opens the door for truth, repair, and more honest dialogue about America's past and present. Okay, so I have some points here. I'm going to be doing a series on European history, white American history, however you want to term it. All right, just to kind of have us all come to a common ground, all right, about what was going on. I don't have all the answers, all right. I did some research based off of what was online. Okay, I'm just trying to do my best to kind of go across different cultures and kind of bring in history. It's important that we know everybody. We all know all our history, not just Black history, not just European history, Indian history, Asian history, okay, South American, Hispanic, Latino history, because that helps give us an idea of us as the younger generation, what powers and things that are at play that are in foundations and structures that we're in platforms that we're performing off of. All right. So again, it says, for the lack of knowledge, right, my people perish. All right. So this is just giving you the knowledge. So 25 points. Early Europe and identity. In medieval Europe, people identified by tribe, kingdom, or religion. So there was always some sort of identity marker. All right. This whole categorizing you and labeling you didn't just start with America. All right. They started off by, identifying you by your tribe, your kingdom, or your religion. Not being white, English villagers, German peasants, or Irish clans had little in common with each other. okay, except occasional trade or conflict. Skin color was not the primary marker of belonging. Culture and geography were far more important. The concept of white people had not yet been invented. This lack of a unified racial identity meant that European divisions ran deep. Wars between Catholic and Protestant states or among rival monarchs, okay, caused bloodshed that far outweighed any unity. The category white was born much later when Europeans needed a way to unify across divisions in the colonial world. So prior to having these sort of like identifiers, there were wars and clashes, right, amongst a lot of the different Europeans, the Irish, and different European nations. All right, they weren't all on the same page. Okay, so there was no sort of like common ground. All right, so when you're trading and you're doing business with different European nations or different Irish or German or French, however, whoever the case, there's a lot of caution, right, that comes with that, right, because you could lose your life. So the Black Death, 1347 to 1351. The plague killed between 25 and 50 million people in Europe, wiping out nearly a third of the continent. This catastrophe shattered medieval economies and created desperation for resources and labor. Entire villages were abandoned. Okay, food was scarce and social order collapsed in many regions. For many Europeans, survival became the central struggle. In this context of crisis, exploration and expansion appeared as solutions. The hunger for land, resource, and trade routes eventually pushed Europe outward. The catastrophic losses of the Black Death primed Europe to pursue colonialism as a way to rebuild. So they're losing people by the millions, right? And just kind of put yourself in their shoes. And again, this isn't me saying I agree with everything that they've done, but millions of your people are perishing, right? Everywhere you look, you're seeing starvation, you're seeing poverty, right? And I'm sure there were a lot of poor Europeans that were pissed, right, at the monarchs. They're like, these motherfuckers are getting fat, they're eating. We're out here dying of starvation, right? So there's a lot of rage, there's a lot of pain. And then someone comes in and say, hey man, I got a way out. I got a way up out of here, right? So when and this is just being a human being, when you're in a condition of just suffering, right, anything sounds better than what you're dealing with, right? So starvation and famines. Europe experienced recurring famines between the 14th and 17th centuries, long before America's settlement. Crops failed due to harsh winters, all right, poor farming methods, and soil exhaustion. Ordinary peasants often ate bread mixed with bark, grass, or clay to survive. Okay. In Ireland, the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 devastated the populations, pushing millions to immigrate, right? Starvation made leaving Europe for colonies in the Americas a matter of survival. Many of these desperate migrants would later be folded into the white racial category in America. Their poverty was erased by the privileges they gained in comparison to African indigenous communities. All right. So a lot of people were just coming from just very, very harsh poverty conditions. All right. And for them, they're like, hey, you can come to America, get you some land, right? You're white, right? And you can get all these different benefits. Not everybody, right? It wasn't like, hey, if you identified as white, you win, right? I'm pretty sure there were some conditions and a lot of stuff you had to even fight for to even be white. And you look white, right? It's probably had a lot of stuff. Because if you're already coming from a history of division, right? If I'm European and I don't really gel well with Irish, right? I don't really gel well with the Italians or with the Germans or the French, right? Just because you can become white doesn't mean that you're going to get it. Right? So I'm pretty sure there was some qualifiers, right? Because there's already a history, right? If I got history with you and you kill some of my family members and you're like, hey man, I'm white like you, like, motherfucker, hold up, didn't you kill my cousin and my brother, right? So I'm sure there was some tension there. So sugar and colonial wealth. Sugar was called the white gold in the 16th and 17th centuries because of its enormous profits. European nations, particularly Spain and Portugal, created vast plantations in the Caribbean. These plantations required brutal slave labor, tying the expansion of sugar directly to African enslavement. The wealth sugar the wealth sugar generated funded European wars, monarchies, and economic growth. Hey, what's up, Buttercup? And economic growth. Okay, so sugar was a big deal. Let me see. But for Europeans themselves, sugar meant dependence on colonial exploitation. ordinary citizens had little access to this wealth unless they migrated to the colonies. All right. So can you imagine having to leave your home just to get a piece of some of the wealth from Europe, from some of the wealth from the sugar, right? I'm pretty sure there were Europeans who was like, damn, man, like I don't really want to have to go all the way over to the Americas. Y'all ain't got shit out there, right? It's just land, it's India. I don't know who the fuck is out there, right? I got to give up all of this for this idea of a lot of elitists who I don't even really work. I don't even really, I don't run with them, right? I'm not saying all were thinking this way, but think about the ones who thought differently, right? They're like, damn, I got to give up everything I know to trust these motherfuckers, and they let my people die. Right? We got to go off of whatever sort of blind faith they have. Oh, come to the Americas, you can have it all. You can have land. There's probably a lot of suspicion. Like, how can we should we trust it? We trust these Irish. We trust these Europeans. So what to say, but for Europeans themselves, sugar meant dependence on colonial exploitation. Ordinary citizens had little access to this wealth unless they migrated to the colonies. Sugar set the stage for both global capitalism and racial hierarchies that centered around white elites. All right. So the elitists are telling them, listen, you're not going to get a piece of this unless you come to America. All right. There's some conditions here. So we're going to go to the 1600s, the birth of whiteness in Virginia. In colonial Virginia, elites feared uprising. Listen to this. Elites feared uprisings of poor Europeans and enslaved Africans. All right. So you had some poor Europeans and Africans that were tired of the shit, right? They just wasn't, they saw clearly what was going on. All right. So a lot of this was driven by elitists. All right. So it says Bacon's rebellion in 1776 showed how poor whites and enslaved blacks could unite against the wealthy. All right. And I believe that's what the government today is afraid of today, is that Bacon's rebellion, right? Where these poor whites, right, who understand how it feels to be marginalized and to come from poverty and to be just sort of or ostracized, right, from the group, right? They could connect and understand, where black people were coming from, all right? So there was a time where, a lot of the black and the whites united, all right, against these elitists, all right? And I believe that's what a lot of this agenda is today, is to keep, a lot of poor whites and Africans and just people in general, even wealthy, like who understand how it feels, right? Because I mean, there is a common thread here. Like, no, we got to divide you, motherfuckers. We don't want you guys understanding each other. No, no, hey, 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 So there was a time in history for you younger African Americans that, you know, whites and blacks did unite against these elitists. Okay, it wasn't just always, white against black. All right, so what does it say? I'm gonna go back. In colonial Virginia, elites feared uprisings of poor Europeans and enslaved Africans. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 showed how poor whites and enslaved blacks could unite against the wealthy. To prevent this, lawmakers passed codes. All right, so you're already seeing a theme here. You have the lawmakers and you have these elites working together to keep a lot of the white people and the black people from uniting. All right, so let's pay attention to that. Again, to prevent this, lawmakers passed codes distinguishing Negroes from Christians. All right. So this, a part of the origins of some of these different concepts was even to separate the white from the black people, right? It was more, I mean, of course, that was, the overall goal, but to separate even the whites or the Europeans who were willing to work, right, with the white people or with the Africans, to further divide them, we got to create these different labels and we're going to attach benefits, right, to these different indicators, okay? So it says to prevent this, lawmakers passed codes distinguishing Negroes from Christians, gradually shifting the language towards race. By the early 1700s, Virginia laws explicitly used the word white to create privilege for poor Europeans. All right. So, in a way, these lawmakers and these elites knew what the fuck they were doing, right? They're like, these poor white people, I know they're going to side with these niggas. So, we got to do something to give these poor people an incentive, right? Poverty is a motherfucker. All right. That's like when you're poor and you're starving and your people got to eat, you got kids, your kids got to eat, sometimes you make choices out of desperation. All right, growing up in Detroit, I've seen poverty, right? And I've seen not compared to different countries and different things like that, but I know how it feels to not have shit, right? And a lot of times when you're in your like you see it today with black people, right? A lot of the crimes they commit outside of the ignorant ass ones are crimes of poverty, right? We don't have shit, right? So they're looting, and they're doing all of this shit, right? So put yourself in the mind of a European, right? You're poor, right? You don't have shit. Your family's starving. You're hungry. You're seeing the elite white people. They're eating, right? They're getting fat, right? But you're poor, right? So they start creating these labels and these different identifiers, and they're attaching benefits to it. If you're white, you can get this, you can get that. All right. So they, in a lot of ways, they capitalize off of that poverty scarcity mindset. All right. Just think about that. So it says by the early 1700s, Virginia laws explicitly used the word white to create privilege for poor white Europeans, for poor Europeans. They're like, yeah, we can't have these motherfuckers united. you know, we can't have that. You know, these privileges included the right to own land. Look at all the shit that they're giving. When you're in a scarcity mindset already, you're already fucking starving. And then they come to you and say, look, man, if you can be white, you can get land. You can have guns, you can bear arms, and avoid permanent enslavement because they were enslaving the damn white people too, right? It wasn't just niggas that was enslaved. Now, granted, the conditions might have been different. I don't know how the conditions were. I won't there. For all we know, they could have been tearing up Europeans' ass too. And you got to think, if you're European, you already got beef with Irish. Oh, now I can enslave your ass. We don't know how they would. They was probably tearing them motherfuckers up, right? And of course, in the history books, it was like, hey, you guys only gonna do 3 years, and then you out. We don't know what the fuck was going on. All right, we wasn't there. All right, but just based off of how I know humans can be, there were probably, if you had the opportunity to get payback to a lot of these European nations and Irish and French, all these different cultures who you had war with in the past, now you guys got to get on code. Man, they were probably tearing them motherfuckers up, right? Because now I get to get payback, right? So just think about that. They don't want a lot of black people. They don't want you motherfuckers thinking. You got to kind of put all this shit together. So you have the lawmakers and you have the elites working together to keep furthering that divide between the poor whites and the Africans. And then by the 1700s, Virginia laws explicitly used the word white to create privilege for poor Europeans. These privileges included the right to own land, bear arms, and avoid permanent enslavement. Whiteness became a shield that poor Europeans clung to, even if they remained exploited by the elites. So even if they identified as white, right, there was still exploitation there. This marked one of the earliest legal constructions of whiteness in America. So, really, whiteness came about off of capitalizing off of the scarcity mindset among the poor whites, right? They did not want these poor whites unifying again like they did in the Bacon's Rebellion with these enslaved Africans because they knew they would be fucking done. So, really, whiteness was a term that was created off of capitalizing and maximizing off of the scarcity mindset in poor Europeans to further divide them from unifying against these governments, right? We can't have you motherfuckers uniting, right? So when we're saying, hey, you're a white person, hey, you a white person, we really just fall into that trap of what these elites fucking centuries ago were looking to do, right? We want to divide you motherfuckers, right? Even the term white was meant to divide the nation from really unifying, right, against these governments, all right? So just think about that. So the Irish struggles before whiteness. In Europe, the Irish were long considered inferior by the English. English propaganda often described them as barbarous, right? Savage, or even subhuman. Sound familiar, right? Many Irish peasants live under crushing poverty and colonial oppression by the British. Okay. When they immigrated to America during the 19th century, they were not fully accepted as white. Signs often read, "No Irish need apply," okay, showing their outsider status. But over time, Irish immigrants were absorbed into the white identity. So early on, a lot of Irish are getting treated like black folks, right? Don't even apply, right, if you're Irish. So this shit wasn't just, white versus black, European versus African, all right? They didn't even like people who maybe looked like them, right, based off of their region and things like that, where they were coming from. All right, for you younger people who may not have known that, right? It didn't just start off as white versus black, European versus African. There was European versus Irish, all right? We don't want you Irish to apply, all right? So that shows you how deep hatred can go, right? Sometimes it's just deeper than the color of your skin, okay? So But over time, the Irish immigrants were absorbed into the white identity, often by aligning against African Americans. This inclusion gave them a new status, but also reinforced racial divide. So the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, Spain and Portugal were among the first European empires to colonize the Americas. Their racial systems in Latin America were highly stratified, with dozens of categories for mixed ancestry. So even in Spain, right, they had a lot of different segregation, right, based off of the mixed blood, that you carry. Whiteness was at the top of this hierarchy, granting access to power and privilege. Spanish colonizers often intermarried with indigenous populations, creating mestizo cultures. Still being pure Spanish or pure Portuguese was treated as superior. In contrast, Anglo colonies in North America eventually enforced stricter racial boundaries. This difference shaped how whiteness evolved across the Americas, all right? So, German migration. Large numbers of Germans migrated to America in the 1700s and 1800s, fleeing religious persecution and economic hardship. Many settled in Pennsylvania and the Midwest. At first, they were viewed as foreigners who did not fit in with the Anglo-American mold. Over time, Germans gained inclusion into the white category, particularly by adopting English customs and distancing themselves from African Americans. Their work ethic and farming skills became celebrated as white virtues. All right. So early on, when a lot of these different European nations were coming over, they were not initially accepted. Right. There was probably hundreds of years before they really jailed in. And it was like, in a way, they had to sort of abandon their own identities, right? Their own cultures, right? So I'm sure there was some inner conflict there with the Germans, right? And even with, Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, right? You're almost having to just abandon who you were prior to some of these rigid sort of narratives, right? Because it says at first they were viewed as foreigners who did not fit in or did not fit the Anglo-American mold. Over time, Germans gained inclusion into the white category, particularly by adopting English customs and distancing themselves from African Americans. Their work ethic and farming skills became celebrated as white virtues. However, in Europe, Germans themselves had lived through famine, okay, plagues and wars that made migration necessary. Their struggles reveals how suffering in Europe turned into privilege in America, right? The role of religion in whiteness. Religion played a major role in early identity. In the Middle Ages, Christians distinguished themselves from Muslims, Jews, and pagans, not from black or white. The Crusades reinforced the religious boundary, with Europeans defining themselves as Christendom. In colonial America, however, the language shifted from Christian to white. This change stripped religious differences and replaced them with racial ones, okay? The new category of whiteness united Catholics, Protestants, and other Europeans under one label. It allowed rulers to suppress divisions and consolidate power. All right. By the 1600s and 1700s, legal codes and colonial writings began to use white as an identity marker. Court records in Virginia and Maryland explicitly reference white as distinct from Negro or Indian. This was not common language in Europe, but it became normal in the colonies. Okay. Books, sermons, and political writings reinforced the category. Whiteness was framed as both natural and divinely ordained. Over time, it became embedded in education and culture. This shows how white was a colonial creation, not a European one. All right. The poor European peasant class. Most Europeans in the 15th to 18th centuries lived in extreme poverty. They were tenant farmers, sharecroppers, or laborers tied to the land with little chance of advancement. Disease, hunger, and cold winters defined their lives more than any sense of superiority. When they came to the New World, elites offered them a new status, whiteness. This gave them the illusion of belonging to the ruling class, even if they were still poor. By separating them from enslaved Africans and indigenous people, colonial elites secured their loyalty. All right. Whiteness thus worked as a type of control, a tool of control, granting poor Europeans symbolic power while keeping wealth tied to the elite. All right. So a lot of this was psychological. All right. You motherfuckers still poor, but I'm going to allow you to think because of this term or this concept of whiteness that we're all family. But in reality, you get your ass back out there in the farm and keep, building up this money for our economy. We're not really alike, but I'll let you guys, it's like almost like an imaginary tool to kind of allow the poor whites to feel like they belonged, right? and also a division tool because they didn't want them aligning with the indigenous groups and the Africans. All right. So what it says, in their wealth, even though the poor Europeans were still going to the elites. All right. So it was like they were still not benefiting financially. It was more of just like again, that scarcity mindset and that wanted to, they were really playing off of like psychological concepts like scarcity, belonging, right? Connection, right? These is what sort of like they were kind of like capitalizing off of, right? So it says Eastern European struggles. Poles, Hungarians, and other Eastern Europeans were often regarded as less civilized by Western Europe. All right. So a lot of these concepts have been around. All right. Eastern Europeans were already looking at, our Western Europeans were already looking at Eastern Europeans as less civilized. So this less civilized, sort of like, these people are barbarians. These concepts were around prior, right? To then before it just became attached to Black folks. All right, they were already kind of looking at, their own, in similar ways. Okay, so again, Poles, Hungarians, and other Eastern Europeans were often regarded as less civilized by Western Europe. Okay, they were subject to stereotypes of backwardness and ignorance. When they migrated to America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were placed at the margins of whiteness. Over time, however, they too were included in the white category, especially as labor unions and social structures reinforce racial hierarchies. All right. Their inclusion came at the cost of distancing themselves from Black and immigrant groups. This dynamic shows that whiteness was flexible, able to expand to include new groups as needed. It was never a biological category, but a political and cultural invention. All right. This was about politics. All right. The plague of 1665 in London. The Great Plague of London killed nearly 100,000 people in one year. Panic, chaos, and death filled the streets. Many fled the city, and the poor were abandoned to die. All right. These repeated outbreaks across Europe weakened populations and destabilized economies. Such conditions motivated European elites to look overseas for new wealth. Colonies were seen as escape routes from disease, famine, and overcrowding. Whiteness later became the glue that bound these immigrants together in their new lands. All right. So a lot of colonialism was more than just going to take over the land, right? And murdering people. It was tied to escaping poverty, disease, overcrowding, right? Death, essentially. Irish famine and migration, 1845 to 1852. The Great Hunger caused the death of over a million Irish and forced another million to flee. British mismanagement worsened the crisis as food exports continued while Irish peasants starved. All right. When Irish immigrants arrived in America, they faced discrimination, poverty, and dangerous working conditions. They were not initially welcomed as white, but were eventually integrated by aligning with racial hierarchies. Irish workers often competed with black laborers, leading to tensions. By adopting whiteness, the Irish gained access to jobs and political power. This transformation highlights how whiteness was earned through exclusion of others. All right. You probably had Irish who didn't really care to, align against the Africans and these different groups because they're like, our beef is not with them, right? We're looking at you Europeans as the fucking enemy, right? You guys done killed off so many of our people, but it was again capitalizing off of that scarcity, right? That poverty, right? And and tapping into this idea of connection, right? So the role of colonization in creating whiteness. Colonial societies in the America were multi-ethnic, with Africans, natives, and Europeans living side by side. Elites needed a way to control labor and prevent unity. They did not want you motherfuckers unifying. All right. It's so interesting. They got the United States of America, but do they really want you guys to unite? Right? Because if you really unite across ideologies and you really have a common ground, you can overthrow a lot of these corrupt governments, right? These corrupt policing practices, right? So they have to keep these terms and these concepts, right? You're white, you're black, right? You're fucking Christian, you're Jew. They got to keep a lot of this. That's why in the Bible it says you're neither Jew nor Gentile, right? You're one in Christ. Jesus tried to promote unity, right? He saw what the enemy was trying to do through creating these terms, right? Language is so divisive, right? So there was always an elite class, right? And a poor class. So the elites, the lawmakers, their goal was to keep a lot of you people separated and divided. All right. What it say? Colonial societies in the Americas were multi-ethnic, with Africans, natives, and Europeans living side by side. Elites needed a way to control labor and prevent unity. Okay, the invention of whiteness provided that solution. Laws gave Europeans special rights regardless of their wealth, while Africans and natives were enslaved or dispossessed. So it says this system reduced class solidarity and replaced it with racial hierarchy. I'm gonna say it again. This system reduced class solidarity and replaced it with racial hierarchy. Whiteness then was not only cultural but structural, embedded in law and economy. It was a system that manufactured loyal to colonial elites, that manufactured loyalty. So the Spanish casta system in Latin America, Spain developed a casta system with dozens of racial categories. Peninsularies, Spaniards born in Spain, and Criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas, were at the top. Mixed race categories like mestizo, mulatto, and zombo reflected the diversity of the colonies. Whiteness was associated with purity of blood and access to privilege. This hierarchy shaped societies for centuries and influenced the ideas of whiteness beyond Spain. It says it shows that whiteness was tied to power and lineage, not simply skin tone. The Costa system reinforced whiteness as a global framework for dominance. Okay. German Enlightenment and race theories. During the Enlightenment, German philosophers like Kant and Hegel wrote about race. They often placed Europeans at the top of hierarchies and Africans at the bottom. These ideas spread into scientific racism in the 18th and 19th centuries. While not all Germans accepted this, it influenced how whiteness was rationalized. Migration of Germans to America brought both their cultural and these ideas, their culture and these ideas. Theories of superiority became part of the justification for slavery and segregation. Whiteness, therefore, was supported not only by law, but also by intellectual thought. In America, legal cases defined who was white and who was not. Court rulings in the 19th century decided whether Armenians, Syrians, or Indians could be legally white. Whiteness was often defined as being European, though the boundary shifted. The courts used whiteness to decide access to citizenship, property, and rights. This legal foundation cemented whiteness as a gatekeeper category. It showed that whiteness was a matter of law, not science. The courtroom became one of the main arenas where whiteness was constructed. Okay. Not all white people supported racial oppression. Abolitionists like John Brown gave their lives fighting slavery. White women like the Grimke sisters broke social norms to speak out against slavery. Many white Christians joined movements that challenge racial injustice. Their sacrifices remind us that whiteness is not a monolith. Within the category, there were those who resisted the system. Their stories complicate the narrative and show that whiteness contained both privilege and dissent. All right. So there were a lot of, you know, people who were a part of this class that did not agree with slavery, right? And the racism that was going on, right? And again, John Brown gave up his life. The Civil War forced America to confront racial identity and privilege. Many white soldiers fought to preserve slavery, while others fought to abolish it. For poor whites, the war was also about land and opportunity. Whiteness shaped how soldiers understood their role in society. The end of slavery did not end with whiteness, but reinforced it as Reconstruction introduced new laws to maintain racial hierarchy. Jim Crow laws gave poor whites a sense of superiority over. So it got back again, the law and the court systems, all right, playing a role, all right, these elitists in the courts playing a role again in further dividing the populations, right? So you have the Jim Crow laws gave poor whites a sense of superiority over freed blacks. This continuity shows how whiteness adapted even after massive social change. Whiteness and immigration restrictions in the early 20th century, America restricted immigration from Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. Southern and Eastern Europeans were considered less desirable than Northern Europeans. Over time, however, Italians, Greeks, and Jews were included in whiteness. These shifts highlight how whiteness could expand when politically useful. Immigration laws reveal whiteness as a gatekeeping tool for national identity. It was never static, but always changing. Inclusion often depended on assimilation, and rejection of non-white groups. All right, you only can become white if you guys reject these non-white groups. All right, if you aligning with these niggers and you're out here hanging out with the indigenous groups, you're out of here. All right, so there's a lot of fear behind that. All right, so this term whiteness was really created as a political tool. Right, it was birthed in a lot of these courtrooms. Right, in these rooms with these elites. Right, because the poor Europeans didn't have any fucking power. All right, and there was already division between Eastern and Western Europe, Northern and Southern Europe. Right, Europeans and Irish. There was already divisions amongst their own sort of like nations. All right, so there was already some suspicion. Okay, so they had all these different conditions even before you became white. You have to completely divorce yourself from these niggas. Okay, labor unions often reinforce whiteness. Many excluded black and Asian workers, preserving privilege for European immigrants. This created divisions that weakened collective power. At the same time, some radical unions fought for multiracial solidarity, but they were often crushed. Whiteness was used by elites to divide the working class. By granting small advantages to white workers, systems of inequality were preserved. This shows how whiteness functioned as a wedge in economic struggles. Okay. Whiteness was not just an American phenomenon, it spread with colonialism worldwide. In Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, claim Europeans claim superiority through whiteness. Colonies were structured so that whiteness meant authority and indigenous meant subject. This global reach tied whiteness to empire. It linked Europe, America, and colonies in one system of hierarchy. The idea of whiteness became a universal passport of power. Okay, understanding this global dimension is crucial for understanding today's inequalities. All right, so we're almost done. During the 1950s and the 1960s, some white allies stood with black leaders. People like Viola Luiso and Andrew Goodman were killed for supporting civil rights. See, they're already, taking you out. If you're white, European, and you're siding, with these African Americans, we're going to take you out. All right. So a lot of, Europeans and different groups, were in a way kind of coerced through fear, right, to identify. So you have to be willing, if you are white, you have to be willing to lose your life, all right, if you're going to sit up here and you're going to associate with these African American people. All right, it was life and death, just like it was for the African Americans if they caught you, off the plantation or messing around with, different whites, or if you were accused of something. So it was life and death on both ends. Okay. So it says their sacrifice showed that not all white Americans embraced racial hierarchy. Still, the majority benefited from systems of privilege. This tension within whiteness reveals its complexity. All right. Allies remind us that identities can be used for justice as well as oppression. Their legacy continues to inspire multiracial movements today. Whiteness is not just history, it shapes present realities from housing to education to criminal justice. Whiteness still influences opportunity. Understanding its origin shows that it is not natural but constructed. It was created to protect privilege and divide people. Recognizing this opens the door for solidarity across communities. It challenges myths that race is fixed or biological. Most importantly, it allows us to build a more just future by telling the truth about the past. So I learned some things. I hope you guys learned some things. This is just part one to my series. I'll be doing some more videos to kind of further educate, right, the people on the history of this thing we call racism today. So as you see, whiteness was constructed in the courts as a political tool by the elitists, all right, to further divide the class and to reduce unity and to provide and to create racial hierarchy, all right. And not all Europeans and Irish and Germans and indigenous groups identified as white. All right. There were a lot of allies. There were a lot of people who fought against this, but they capitalized off of the scarcity, the poverty, right? This sort of like illusion of unity and connection and privilege, right? And also off of you wanted to make money to provide for your family, right? There was a lot of sort of like strategy tied to a lot of these labels. All right. So I have to go. I hope you guys have a blessed day. Part one of my series on how Europeans became white. I hope you learned something today. Hoping God keep you guys safe. All right.